Hey guys, just doing a quick lecture on the slides. These slides cover weeks 2 and 3. I just got a little ahead of myself, but it's all super related. So even if you're only doing week 2 today for your discussion leader or responses, it helps to read all the way through. And week 3 will get a bit of an advantage with all this extra information as well. So let's start off. What is IR? Before we do the what is IR, let me give you my definition of politics. And if you're in the comparative class, you already heard this definition, but my definition is the relationships of power between people. I really love this definition because it encompasses a lot. It's a very broad definition. And one of the key things about government, which is how a lot of you defined political, is that it's a hierarchy. It's how people order other people around, how compliance is achieved, how things get done, and things are done by using force or power. So I really think this definition, the relations of power among people, and then by extension, among states, among governments, I think that covers most of what we consider political. For example, office politics, for example, the relationship between teacher and student, because these relationships are inherently hierarchical and power based, I believe that falls in the definition of politics. And I think it's I don't care what definition you use for politics as long as you define it and you back it up. But I feel that a broad definition has a lot of benefits. So with that being said, what is IR, right? The basic definition, the book definition and the textbook, it's going to say it's the relationships between sovereign states. Sovereign mean that they're in charge of their own internal affairs. But that's just a super simple definition because, as we know from real life, everyone that watches the news, IR, international relationships, is way more complicated than that. What about corporations? What about the church? UN, WHO, obviously with the pandemic, we hear that all the time. What's going on with that? Financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, G8, as you can imagine. Although those kind of fall into the wayside a bit for a long time, especially in the 90s. Those were institutions that were putting a lot of pressure on different countries, and we have to take that into account when we're talking about international relations. Terrorist organizations, they're not states, but we certainly interact with them on an international scale, I would say. And then, of course, transnational social movements, for example, the Bolshevik movement, which led to the USSR. We could say anything, a lot of things in that category. Black Lives Matter. We could say the Me Too movement. These things transcend borders and have a huge impact on how we're governed and how we view the relationships between people. So I really, again, I like broad definitions, but the textbook IR definition, relationship between sovereign states, that's fine. But I think IR means a lot more than that. And everyone put a great definition for international. I would just say be careful when you're saying anything outside of the United States, simply because that's a United States centric approach, right? Anyone in a different country would say anything outside of France, right? But or whatever country you want to pick. But I want to steer away from like focusing on your own country, that kind of U.S. centric approach. So just be careful with that. It's not necessarily wrong or anything. It's just it can be problematic when you define something like that. So we got the definition of political out. We got the definition of, well, my definition of political. We've defined IR. We can use that very specific term or we can use the broad term. Let's look at globalization because it's impossible to talk about international relations without how interconnected everything has been. So some people say that globalization is going to eventually, ideally, end the idea of a nation state, the sovereign state, what we would call a country, right? And lead eventually into international government, global government, right? Transcending borders. Do we have that right now? I think obviously not, right? People don't like to let go of power. States don't like to let go of power. And once you establish something like national identity, it's incredibly hard to detach someone from it. Yet at the same time, we know globalization has merged cultures. We have a shared, for the most part, global capitalist system. Even countries that don't call themselves capitalist uh, work and participate in the system. Values have changed over time, and all these different things mix, clash, and integrate, and create uh, a world that would not have been imaginable to the people living in, say, anything before the 40s or the 50s. So iron globalization, it's impossible these days to talk about them like they're separate. They're intertwined. They're essentially phenomena that globalization is a phenomena that is a result of international relations. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about IR. It's just good to know, and it's a good conceptualization to have. So I guess we need a nice definition for this. I got this definition, the first one, from my professor at Storrs. It's a bit of a lengthy one. The whole complex of cultural, economic, legal, military, political, and social relations of all states, as well as their component populations and entities. That entails a lot. He's pretty much saying everything is IR, and everyone involved in these countries and any organization in these countries is related to international relations. I agree. I agree with him. But I just think this definition is a bit long because I feel like legal, military kind of falls under political, based on my definition, and then cultural kind of falls under social as well for me. So I just kind of compact it: the social, economic, and political relations between any person, entity, or state in the realm of international. So now I'll get to in the realm of the international in a minute, what that means. But I just want you to know this is not a set in stone definition. This is just specifically the way I view this term and how I use it to identify problem solutions. If you want to come up with your own definition, which might be more narrow or might be just slightly different in the conceptualization of what it entails, that's cool. That's fine. As long as when you're talking about it, you define it. And if you're talking about this in a presentation, everything makes sense within that definition. So again, this is very free form. You're allowed to define your own things. This is just my definition. So what do I mean by the realm of the international? Well, for most of the theories that we're going to talk about in class, the international is defined by lack of global government. We have the UN, like I said, but the UN really has no capability to enforce its own laws, right? So it's anarchy. And I don't mean anarchy as in chaos. I mean anarchy as in what it means. Probably a secondary definition, if you look it up in the dictionary, is that there's no hierarchical government. Each state, like we said, is its own sovereign entity. It makes its own rules. So this just means that there's possibility at the very least for conflict. If every state can make its own rules and it's beholden to no higher order, the complex relations are going to manifest. I'm already at the 10-minute mark